On January 13th, local time in the United States, the Biden administration released the interim final rules for the diffusion of artificial intelligence regulations. After reading the contents of this report, I have two feelings. The first feeling is that I am overjoyed. The United States has actually expanded its reach to the entire world. This completely disperses their attacking power, which is a strategic error. They have divided nearly 200 countries and regions around the world into 3 tiers. The first tier consists of the United States and its 18 allies, including Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Germany, France, French Guiana, Ireland, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, Sweden, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. There are no restrictions on purchasing American computing hardware for these countries, and ironically, India is not included in this list. India is also restricted from purchasing computing hardware from the United States. Companies headquartered in the United States can deploy up to 25% of their computing power in countries outside the first tier. If it is a single non-first tier country, the deployment is limited to no more than 7%. The second tier comprises around 140 countries and regions, including Singapore, Mexico, India, Malaysia, Israel, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Portugal, Turkey, and others. Each country or region can obtain a maximum of about 50,000 AI GPUs during the 3-year period from 2025 to 2027. It is worth noting that Singapore, India, Israel, and Mexico are included in this list, but this number is simply too small. It would take 3 years for these countries to purchase 50,000 equivalent H100 GPUs. According to a report released by the market research firm Omdia, just one company, Meta, purchased over 150,000 NVIDIA GPU H100s in 2023, and Microsoft's purchase quantity was even higher. Additionally, companies like Amazon, Google, and Tencent only received around 50,000 units. In other words, the total purchasing volume of these second-tier countries over 3 years is far less than what a single American tech company purchases in a year. The computing power ceiling for these countries has been thoroughly restricted, and the Americans even specified in the report the maximum amount that can be purchased each quarter from the first quarter of 2025 to the fourth quarter of 2027. However, the United States has created 3 exceptions. First, these countries and regions can sign government agreements with the United States. If they agree to the political conditions imposed by the United States, such as cooperating with U.S. export controls and human rights requirements, then the quota can increase to 100,000. Second, individual entities in these countries can purchase up to 1,700 GPUs, which are exempt from the 50,000 limit. In other words, the Americans believe that a single entity acquiring 1,700 GPUs won't achieve much, and of course, the Americans will definitely control this. For instance, they will check customer lists annually to see who has made purchases, preventing anyone from engaging in ant-like behavior by establishing a bunch of entities to buy cards and then reselling them to the same company. The final exception allows entities headquartered in these countries to apply for national verification of end-user qualifications. If they obtain this qualification, they can purchase up to 320,000 GPUs over the next 2 years, which is a very large number. I believe this exception is intended for a few large enterprises, as countries like Singapore, Israel, and Portugal in Europe are all in the second tier. This provision is aimed at specific large enterprises. After all, countries such as Singapore, Israel, and Portugal are classified in the second tier. Not only GPU chips, but the US has also imposed restrictions on advanced closed-source large models, which corresponds to the export of weights for open-source large models. Large models contain a vast number of parameters, and the weights represent the importance of these parameters. The report states that the weights of advanced AI models can only be produced through the use of thousands of advanced computing chips over a period of several months or longer, trained on a massive input of data. If the training is inadequate, the model may yield meaningless outputs. Therefore, weights are of paramount importance. Restricting exports can mitigate various threats posed by large models, such as applications related to US security, including the development of nuclear and biological weapons. The third tier includes mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, Iran, Belarus, Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, and 22 other countries and regions, which are largely prohibited from importing advanced AI chips from the US. Of course, the weights of closed-source large models are also strictly prohibited. Why did I feel a sense of relief upon seeing this US sanction measure? In the past, US strikes and sanctions against China were targeted. For example, in 2018, they first focused their efforts on ZTE and subsequently on Huawei. If the US could concentrate its firepower to take down Huawei completely, then the development of China's ICT industry would slow down significantly. After all, Huawei holds a unique position in the Chinese ICT industry, particularly in the hardware sector, which is easily demonstrable. Huawei's smartphones gradually exited the market in the fourth quarter of 2020 and returned in the fourth quarter of 2023. Throughout these 3 years, no other domestic smartphone brand had the capacity to challenge Apple's global dominance, but over time, the Americans appear to have overlooked the necessity of concentrating power for it to be effective, resulting in an increasing number of Chinese companies being added to the entity list, including DJI, iFlytek, Hikvision, Dahua, OFilm, and SMIC. Hundreds of Chinese companies, including Northern Huachuang and Cambricon, are now contending with a fragmented US strike force, and the market for US companies has shrunk. For example, iFlytek, which is also on the entity list, is unable to procure US hardware and has opted to purchase Huawei's Ascend chips. Since April 2023, iFlytek and Huawei have formed a joint team and quickly established the world's first Ascend 10,000 card computing platform, dubbed Flying Number 1, in October 2023, becoming the first domestic computing platform capable of supporting the training of trillion-parameter large models. This marks the world's first 10,000 card cluster platform developed independently of US technology. This process not only generated an estimated revenue of over 1 billion RMB for Huawei, but also allowed iFlytek, as a manufacturer of large AI models, to provide Huawei with various technical feedback throughout this process, significantly enhancing its capabilities. This is Huawei's first attempt at a 10,000 card cluster. Had iFlytek not been placed on the entity list, it remains uncertain whether such cooperation would have taken place. What if iFlytek hadn't been placed on the entity list? We wouldn't know whether such cooperation would have existed. Now, the US has broadened the scope of its restrictions and sanctions, and its striking power has been dispersed across the globe. Of course, the US claims this is to prevent GPU cards from spreading from second-tier countries to third-tier countries like China. However, it's evident that the US has created a larger problem in trying to resolve a tricky issue. My second impression is that opportunities for China have genuinely arrived. The Americans have unexpectedly handed over the markets of around 170 countries and regions to us. After the release of these sanctions, NVIDIA voiced strong opposition. NVIDIA's Vice President of Government Affairs, Ned, stated that extreme national online policies will prompt countries to seek alternative technologies, accelerating the loss of America's technological leadership. I believe American politicians appear to disregard the democratic process in their decision-making and only care about the democratic form of voting during elections. In my opinion, this has two consequences. Firstly, it exhibits clear racist and ideological characteristics. The first-tier countries are mainly white nations, while Japan and South Korea function as semi-colonies under US military presence and strong influence. Only Taiwan, due to its status as a semiconductor production hub, already has the ability to produce GPUs. The second tier mainly consists of Black, Arab, Latino, Southeast Asian, and South Asian countries, which are non-white nations. In the third tier, countries like China, Russia, and Venezuela are all nations that do not heed US commands. This tiered approach will further expose the essence of the American elite's white supremacist ideology to the world. Second, this marks the first time in history that the US has imposed such a blatant productivity embargo on the majority of countries worldwide, greatly stimulating a shift towards purchasing from China. In fact, the US has previously blocked technology from most countries, such as in the military sector with the F-35, which only close allies of the US can purchase, while other countries cannot buy it. This strategic and expensive fighter jet being unavailable is somewhat understandable, as most countries cannot afford it. Moreover, fighter jets are not productivity tools. However, in the civilian product sector, particularly GPUs, which are crucial for national development, directly restricting sales to over 100 countries and limiting their development in infrastructure is something I don't recall happening before. So, for over 100 countries and regions globally to solve their development issues, as long as China can supply products, why wouldn't they turn to China? For China's supply chain, it's as if someone has placed food right in front of us. Chinese computing hardware companies like Huawei and Cambrian are still focused on addressing the domestic shortage of computing power, mainly constrained by manufacturing capacity. If semiconductor manufacturing capacity is resolved, it will be a great opportunity for China's hardware and ecosystem to go global. Once they secure a foothold in the future, the combined market of second-tier and third-tier countries will greatly surpass that of the US and its 18 allies. This will be a catastrophic blow to the US semiconductor industry. Currently, this ban has a 120-day grace period, but it feels like a significant showdown is on the horizon. The curtain is being raised. Currently, domestically produced AI computing chips, primarily based on Ascend, are in short supply, and even the financial performance of Cambricon, which has been operating at a loss for years, is projected to improve significantly in 2024. If there is demand overseas, I believe that domestic manufacturers will also look to expand into international markets. Thus, 2025 is likely to mark the beginning of Chinese AI chip hardware entering international markets. As I mentioned earlier, one can gauge the pace of de-Americanization in semiconductor manufacturing capacity by examining Huawei's market share. In the third quarter of 2024, Huawei's smartphone market share reached 15.3%, an increase of 42% compared to 11.1% in the third quarter of 2023, which reflects the improvement in domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity. I am confident that this rapid growth will persist into 2025. According to IDC data, by the fourth quarter of 2024, the global shipment share of Chinese smartphone manufacturers is projected to reach 56%. If in the future all Chinese smartphone manufacturers adopt domestic chips, it would indicate that domestic smartphone chips could account for over half of the global market. Moreover, if more than 100 countries and regions worldwide purchase a significant quantity of Chinese AI chips, it would suggest that China's share of AI chips could also represent a substantial portion of the global market. The competition between China and the US will then become entirely foreseeable.